Hello everyone, my name is Joseph Evangelista, and I'll be doing my presentation on the topic of pediatric epilepsy and first language development in children. Now, a bit of an introduction as to why I chose this topic. For a little bit over a year now, I've had the privilege of being a caretaker for a boy named Josh who has severe epilepsy. He's 16 years old, but as a result of his epilepsy, he has pretty severe cognitive and intellectual delays, which require him to be supervised pretty much all the time. Specifically, with the last few months and COVID affecting his education, he's been learning from home, and so I've had to tutor him and help him out through that. And I've noticed that he is not a dumb person. He's very, very intelligent, but he is severely delayed in his language production, specifically with comprehension and production of both written and spoken language. So it started to get me thinking of how exactly his epilepsy diagnosis and his seizures affect this language development, and if it's separate from his intellectual development. And so when I was given the opportunity to choose a topic having to do with language acquisition, I chose the correlation between epilepsy and language development. Now, the two questions I'll be asking and hopefully answering are: how does language dysfunction caused by pediatric epilepsy, specifically a disorder called aphasia, affect language production and comprehension in children? And second question: how does this language dysfunction affect the lives of children with epilepsy? Now, before I begin, I encourage you to look below the video where you'll find notes on my presentation, including all the links to all my sources. I really encourage you to follow along with that because what I'll be talking about is quite technical, and so if you don't have some notes to guide you, you can very easily get lost. The subject of epilepsy is extremely broad, and the research on the condition itself is vast. This makes sense considering it is one of the most common and severe neurological diseases in children, according to the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and it affects an estimated 1 to 2% of the pediatric population. It's also important to note that epilepsy is a spectrum, not just a single disease with a single set of symptoms. Much like autism, it affects different children in different ways. However, one of the most common symptoms of epilepsy is language dysfunction. Language dysfunction, just like epilepsy, is a broad spectrum with several possible individual effects, some severe, some mild. Now, unlike studies on epilepsy itself, there has been less emphasis placed on language problems as a result of epilepsy. However, there is still plenty of research to get an accurate picture of the potential effect pediatric epilepsy has on a patient's language function, production, comprehension, and acquisition. First, we'll take a broader look at epilepsy, what exactly it is, its symptoms, some causes, then a brief overview of several different types of language problems resulting from pediatric epilepsy, and then we'll look at an in-depth view of two specific studies which researched the subjects of language dysfunction in pediatric epilepsy and the impact these language problems have on the lives of epilepsy patients. To begin, what is epilepsy, and what does it have to do with language learning, development, and acquisition? Now, we're all pretty familiar with what epilepsy is, and many of us probably know people who have it. The Mayo Clinic defines epilepsy as a central nervous system or neurological disorder in which brain activity becomes abnormal, causing seizures or periods of unusual behavior, sensations, and sometimes loss of awareness. It's important to note that anyone can develop epilepsy, and it affects both males, females of all races, ethnic backgrounds, and ages. Epilepsy has several known causes. However, in nearly half of all patients diagnosed with epilepsy, there is no individual cause doctors can point to say this is why you have epilepsy. Some of the causes could include genetic influences, head trauma, brain conditions such as a stroke, infectious diseases like meningitis or AIDS, prenatal injury, like poor nutrition or oxygen deficiencies in utero, and other developmental disorders such as autism and neurofibrosis, all are linked with the development of epilepsy. One of the most common symptoms of epilepsy is seizures, right? Because epilepsy is caused by abnormal activity in the brain, seizures can affect any process your brain coordinates. Some seizure signs and symptoms include temporary confusion, a staring spell, uncontrollable jerking movements with your arms and legs, loss of consciousness or awareness, and psychic symptoms such as fear or anxiety. Now, beyond the obvious seizure symptoms, epilepsy can have far-reaching effect on brain function and cognition, depending on the severity of the seizures and whether they are focal or generalized. Focal seizures, as the name suggests, are focused on one area of the brain. Generalized seizures on the brain as a whole. Epilepsy can have varying degrees. Epilepsy can cause varying degrees of social and cognitive delays. And one of the most important and common cognitive disorders associated with epilepsy is language dysfunction, a broad term encompassing several speech and language disorders that can arise due to epilepsy. Now, it's important to note that not all epileptics will exhibit dysfunction in their language or cognitive ability. Some epileptics live their entire lives with completely normal functioning brains. However, it is common to see some sort of intellectual, cognitive, or language delay, especially with generalized seizures. We'll be focusing on just one language disorder affecting epilepsy patients and look at it more in depth, specifically aphasia, but there are several disorders associated with language dysfunction. And if you look below, you can see a chart from the U.S. National Library of Medicine that lists some of the several disorders. I'll go over them very briefly, but if you want to look at them further, please, by all means, read. Auditory agnosia is the inability to recognize the symbolic meaning of sounds. Dysarthria is the impairment of speech due to difficulty with strength or coordination of the speech muscles. It can be caused by muscle problems or secondary damage to nerves or brain structures that control the muscles. Prosody is a disorder wherein the normal rhythm of speech is affected in a patient with epilepsy, where they cannot replicate the way we normally intonate and stress when we speak. So either they speak very monotone, robotically sounding, or they have what's called dysprosody, which is where they have intonation and stress, but they put it at the wrong place because they can't figure it out. Another common one is speech dyspraxia or apraxia, which is difficulty in articulation of syllables or words due to impaired motor planning. This is different from dysarthria in that it's not a muscle issue, it's a brain connectivity issue. Again, like I said, if you're more interested in any of these, please, by all means, go to the U.S. National Library of Medicine. I have it linked below, and take a look at this chart. But we will be focusing on one particular language disorder that is the most common and well-researched disorder of epilepsy patients, and that is aphasia, often called the epilepsy-aphasia spectrum, because just like epilepsy, aphasia has more than one symptom and several different ways it can play out in the individual. Aphasia is, in a broad sense, a disorder affecting the production or comprehension of spoken and written language due to acquired damage to the language regions of the dominant, typically the left, hemisphere of your brain. Different components of language are affected depending on the area of brain damage. For instance, there's receptive aphasia, which is the inability to understand spoken or written language. There's expressive aphasia, which is the inability to produce speech or writing. And there's conduction aphasia, which is the inability to repeat due to damage to the part of your brain which connects the Wernicke's and Broca's area. Now, as I said, epilepsy aphasia is a spectrum of diseases, including a disease called Landau-Kleffner syndrome, which a great resource for epilepsy aphasia can be found in a book authored by Thierry Diona and Elaine Roulette titled The Epilepsy Aphasia Spectrum, From Landau-Kleffner Syndrome to Rolandic Epilepsy. This is where I got the majority of my information on the aphasia spectrum. This book focuses a lot on the Landau-Kleffner syndrome, which is one of the most severe and studied conditions of the epilepsy aphasia spectrum. It's named after the researchers who identified the disorder in a study published in 1957, and is hallmarked by rapid language loss in children with seizures, and individuals in the study who were diagnosed with LKS showed no other signs of brain dysfunction aside from language loss. So, as you can see, it's a fairly newly researched field. It's only been around for 50, 60 years. We've been identifying it, so there's still a lot of research left to be done to fully understand these diseases. So now that we have a basic understanding of some of the ways in which epilepsy can affect the language function in children, let's turn our attention to two separate studies meant to understand language dysfunction in the real world. The first study was done with the intention of examining the severity and range of linguistic impairments in young, intermediate, and adolescent youth with epilepsy, and how these deficits were associated with nonverbal intelligence, psychopathology, and reading. The second study focuses more on how the language dysfunction already described affects children with epilepsy on a practical and social level, with an emphasis on how language impairment affects self-other differentiation and results in a compromised ability to resolve social problems. Just like everything else I've been saying, links to these studies will be below this video. I highly recommend you check them out and read them for yourselves because I do not have time to go completely in depth and explain all the procedures behind these studies, but I'll try to give a broad overview. First, let's look at the first and more important of the two studies, titled Language in Pediatric Epilepsy. This study was published in 2009 by researchers from UCLA, the University of California at Irvine, and the California State Fullerton University. They hypothesized that children with epilepsy would have significantly impaired linguistic skills compared to children without epilepsy in the young, intermediate, and older age groups, controlling for performance IQ differences. Now, that last part is important. It's important to note that these researchers were careful to separate linguistic dysfunction from intellectual disability by measuring nonverbal performance IQ of the participants and controlled for the fact that group difference in language scores may be simply due to generally lower cognitive abilities in these subjects. So they specifically chose subjects who were diagnosed with epilepsy who had average intelligence in nonverbal areas. The researchers predicted that the young epilepsy subjects would have significantly more linguistic impairments than the intermediate group, who in turn would have more deficits than the older group, on the basis of the assumption that the brains of younger children with active development processes, such as language, are more vulnerable to the effects of ongoing seizures than those of older children. The study included 284 children, 104 with cryptogenic epilepsy who had complex partial seizures, and 78 children with childhood absence epilepsy. They were aged 6 to 15 years. It also included 102 age and gender-matched children without epilepsy, also aged 6 to 15 years. All subjects underwent testing with the Test of Language Development, or the TOLD, which was developed by Newcomer and Hamill in 1988. They also included reading scores from the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test for the young and intermediate age groups to determine if the predicted impairment linguistic skills of these children were associated with poor reading. Now, the results of this study are very interesting. They found that significantly more epilepsy subjects had language scores 1 standard deviation below average than the age-matched control groups did. The intermediate and adolescent epilepsy groups also had significantly lower mean language scores compared to their matched controls. The older compared to the younger epilepsy groups had more language impairment and a wider range of linguistic deficits. Longer duration of the illness, childhood absence epilepsy, psychiatric diagnosis, and socioeconomic status were all associated with linguistic deficits in the young group, whereas prolonged seizures, lower performance IQ, and adolescent and minority status predicted lower language scores in the intermediate epilepsy group. In the adolescent group, the oldest group, language impairment was associated with poor seizure control, decreased performance IQ, and lower socioeconomic status. Linguistic and reading deficits were significantly related in each epilepsy group. Now, what does all that mean? How can I summarize these results in just a few words? Essentially, they found that children with epilepsy had a significantly lower chance of scoring well in these language proficiency tests. In fact, more of them scored 1 standard deviation below the average. They also found that the older students actually had more language deficiencies and dysfunction than the younger students, contrary to their original hypothesis. This study's findings highlight the clinical, theoretical, developmental, and academic importance of studying language in youth with epilepsy, who have average IQ scores. the significantly higher rate of language scores 1 standard deviation below average in the 3 epilepsy groups should alert clinicians to the need for language evaluations in epilepsy youth with normal intelligence. The second study we'll be looking at sought to establish a link between epilepsy and social cognitive problems and found language dysfunction to be a driving force behind children with epilepsy's inability to differentiate between themselves and others, a crucial component of social interaction. This study, called Language and Self-Other Differentiation in Childhood Epilepsy, a preliminary report, was published in February of 2019 by Catherine M. Bailey and Nancy M. Bolton, so it's a much more recent study. I don't have the time to go in-depth with this study like the first one, and seeing how it is primarily about social ability and not language disability, I needn't dwell on it too long. But the implications for how language dysfunction affect individuals with epilepsy beyond linguistic development are important. This current study represents a preliminary investigation of the association between language and self-other differentiation during social problem solving in school-aged children diagnosed with epilepsy compared to children with and without language problems. Further study needs to be done to firmly establish this link, but the results we have so far are important towards understanding the broader implications of language dysfunction as a result of epilepsy. So what does this mean? The second study basically showed that this language dysfunction, which is typical in children diagnosed with epilepsy, had ramifications on their identification and their social ability. Now, let's take a step back from everything I've said so far and examine how this topic is related to language acquisition. Millions of children around the world have been diagnosed with epilepsy, and a large percentage of these children will exhibit some form of language dysfunction as a result. The more we understand epilepsy as a disease, how it affects our brain, and how it affects our language development, the better we become at developing therapies and techniques with the intention of restoring linguistic capability to children and adults with aphasia or any other epilepsy-related language disorder. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I hope you learned something from this presentation. Perhaps it inspires you to do further research into the subject, or maybe it just gives you a better appreciation for the way epilepsy affects language in patients. Regardless, I really do think it is one of the most important subjects to consider when discussing non-typical language acquisition and development. Thank you so much for listening.